right, so Mr. O'Shea is there. I'm going to bring him in. We'll get back to this other story in a second. Hold on. Dan, how you doing, my friend? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I think you're on mute.
No, I'm not. You got me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I got you 5x5.
Oh, excellent, man. Excellent. How you doing? It's been a while, my friend. How you doing?
I know. Been a while. Good. In fact, shit, I was going to be reaching out to you via email. I am finishing up Into the Lion's Den. Don't get ahead with Kurt, but I'm going to finish it, get in touch with Kurt. I literally have an iMac, which, the big, huge MacBook.
Yeah.
Getting updated right now. And I've gone through, pulled out. I ran across, I don't know, a couple months ago, not a month, like 6 weeks ago. These are the three wheel books that I had from 04 to 06 in Iraq with all my notes from daily notes, taking.
Oh, yeah.
And that plus, and this has been eating at me for a long time for a host of reasons, and not only to get that commitment to Kurt and you guys, but, yeah, I'm not with Equitas anymore. And I want to focus. I've got to get Into the Lion's Den done. I'm tweaking the format a bit, and we can talk about it offline. But let's jump in. When we going live? Are we going live with?
Yeah, we're live right now, bro.
Oh, perfect. Well, then now that I've told all your viewers that Into the Lion's Den is going to get published, I better.
Let's just while we're on that subject, let's promote it. So give your overview of your, give us a 30,000 foot view of your history. You're a Naval Academy grad, former lieutenant commander, former SEAL, but what did you do in Southwest Asia that gave you the amazing expertise to write this book?
Yeah. So like a lot of veterans post 9/11, a lot of us came back, either were active duty or like myself came back on active to, because of the attacks, obviously with the intent that this never happens again. Mm-hmm. And towards the end of my 3-year mobilized service, I accepted one last set of orders to Iraq. It would have been my third deployment, post 9/11. And, I had a wife at home who wanted to start a family. And I said, it's just one more deployment. It's only 120 days in the sandbox.
Right.
And the day I arrived in Baghdad, and I went over with what was called the Joint Interagency Coordination Group, or the Joint Interagency Task Force at a U.S. Central Command. And this was an effort we learned after 9/11, when 9/11 happened, largely because not that we didn't envision something like that happen, but there was a catastrophic failure at the interagency level between our components of government, the intelligence community, the CIA, DIA, mm-hmm. the FBI, law enforcement, stovepiping information, withholding information, not sharing across the lines from DOD to the intelligence to law enforcement to diplomacy. Yeah. And so there was this task force, and it changed its name multiple times. But it started out at U.S. Central Command, obviously the center of the war after 9/11, to basically bring together all the interagency to liaise at U.S. Central Command. So we had reps from Treasury Department, ICE, Immigration, Border Patrol, FBI, CIA, DIA, virtually the entire interagency then sent liaisons to U.S. Central Command, and U.S. Central Command partnered them so that half the staff were these interagency folks, the other half were active duty military. A lot of Marines in the mix, and just basically let's figure out how we do this coordination so that failure to share critical intelligence doesn't happen, which is, we know, one of the big critical things. We could have put together the piece of 9/11 had we just been sharing in the interagency. So that's what this organization was tailored to do. And I was here in 04, lieutenant commander, former, Navy SEAL background, just spent 2 years at U.S. headquarters with General Franks, briefing mm-hmm. flag officers on, special operations missions. Again, I'm a reservist. I'm just doing, the citizen soldier, your classic, reservist who volunteered to, give up a couple years of his life. And I went over for one more assignment and literally flew the FBI team into Baghdad, was living in their compound, had access to the agency with a badge. And then I had a blue badge at the U.S. State Department. So my job was to be an interagency liaison officer, to coordinate across DIME, as diplomacy, intelligence, military, and law enforcement, DIME. Well, day one, I land in Baghdad and I go to my first morning meeting with an Air Force Academy guy named Major General Sargent, who you may know, fighter jock. And I'm in a room with all 06s, all full bird colonels. And it was like a plebe come around. You know, the general
Yeah.
was going down the line going, Colonel, what do you got? Okay, Colonel Jones, what's the next? And very professional, very organized, and, you know, typical military precision. Started it sharply at 07. Meeting was done in 45 minutes with everyone having their taskers. Then I walk across the embassy compound at the old Republican Palace. This is Baghdad, Saddam's former seat of power. And I go to the State Department for my 9 o'clock meeting. And I'm wandering my way through the embassy. I've never been there. I've literally just arrived. And I find the Pull Mill section, political military, which is where the liaison between diplomacy, you know, ambassadors and diplomats, and the military. So I walk in the room and I, you know, see a room with no one's really in charge. It's a circle, you know, round table. People are grabbing coffee, and meeting was starting late. And it was a very different environment, right? Going from the military that I'm used to just the embassy. And when we finally sat down, the chief of staff and another Irish guy named Tom Duffy, Notre Dame guy where my brothers went to school, we talked beforehand. And Tom had been a Navy officer, service warfare, before transitioning to foreign service. So he's leading the meeting. He's going through the ambassador's, you know, key points, and comes to the last item. Now, mind you, this is July 6, 2004. So the insurgency is just getting up on steroids at that point. And he comes to the last order of business, says, hey, folks, last order. 2 Bulgarian truck drivers were kidnapped in Mosul 10 days ago. Some guy named Zarqawi says they're going to cut this guy's head off unless the Bulgarians pull their 500-man battalion out of the coalition of the willing, the 41 nations that were supporting the effort. He said, President Bush spoke to the president of Bulgaria yesterday, said, you're a valued member of the coalition. We, the U.S., will do everything we can to save these hostages. And he said, 2 envoys arrived today at noon. We need to brief them and tell them everything the U.S. is doing to save the lives of these 2 hostages. Well, he looks at the only military guy in the room and says, Dan, you're a Navy SEAL. Go call your friends. And that was the start of what became the next 2 years of my life. And it was, you know, I basically built an interagency organization called the Hostage Working Group. I pulled in everyone from law enforcement, not only U.S. FBI agents, but Iraqi police. I pulled in DIA, CIA, all the intelligence community. And frankly, you know, within 10 days, and this was, mind you, this was a month after the Nick Berg beheading, approximately a month. And so
the journalist,
yeah. And the insurgency realized this is a very effective tool. And if you go back, and I tracked all this, we ended up tracking every kidnapping in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. We tracked every kidnapping, and we put as much intelligence in each column that we could. And we ultimately, you know, when we went back in time, before April of 2004, the kidnapping was not even on the radar screen. It wasn't even being reported. And in April, that 1 month, this is the month the Blackwater convoy got hit. Nick Berg, I think, got grabbed towards the end of the month. But that's the month when the insurgency announced itself. And they did it through this thing called hostage terrorism. And there were 94 incidents, kidnapping incidents in April of 2004.
That's a lot.
March of 2004, there was 0. So in 1 month, on steroids, this new tactic, this new tool. So that meant every person in Iraq, every contractor, every civilian, including Iraqis, most targeted victims actually were local Iraqis. Everyone was a target of this, and it affected everything. And I was thrown into this and realized right away when the month I got to Baghdad, July, there were 31 international kidnappings. It went to 44 and then like 56. So literally my entire 120-day tour was just handling a crisis that was spinning out of control. And, you know, in the midst of it, I learned early on that when I formed the working group and had weekly meetings with the agency, the FBI, the Special Forces Task Force, both JSOC and the others, and like the Green Berets and SEALs that I had just been supporting as a SOC sent officer at higher headquarters. And I'm like the only person that saw this crisis for what it was. In fact, when I got home after this first day on the job, this Bulgarian kidnapping case where we brought it, I tracked an analyst, we brought him in, the U.S. ambassador, the Pull Mill ambassador, at the time it was ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, Ambassador James Jeffries and Ambassador Paul Newman. We briefed them that day, and this young analyst from DI basically said, hey, Zarqawi is the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He is the guy that cut off Nick Berg's head. And if he says he's going to kill your hostages, that's what's going to happen. And the 2 Bulgarian envoys kind of nodded in not in agreement, and they were sitting there chain smoking in a room that had signs that said "Do not smoke," and this was in the ambassador's office. Pretty funny. And they're just sitting there chain smoking, and when they heard that these two were going to be killed, they just kind of said, yes, life is very tragic, and smoked on.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, the analyst turned to the ambassador and said, "Sir, pending your questions, I have to go back to Camp Victory." So the ambassador turned to me and said, "Dan, well, please take care of these guests, and I want to be informed of everything that develops on this case." And this was literally within hours of arriving in Baghdad the night before at about midnight. So day one on the job, it was what I call Message of Garcia, which ironically enough was the very first lesson I learned at the Naval Academy about initiative and getting the job done. And just in a nutshell, it's a parable.
Tell that story. Tell that story real quick.
Yeah, and it's a basis for, you talk to any West Point or Annapolis, I think even at the Air Force Academy, and certainly everyone I know in infantry, every Marine I've ever met knows this story. And it's essentially turn of the century, Spanish-American War. The U.S. wanted to support a rebel. There was a rebel leader leading the insurgency named Garcia. General Garcia was hiding in the jungles of Cuba, and President McKinley wanted to deliver a message to him. And it said, we must get this message that we will support the insurgency against the Spanish. And the War Department, back when the Pentagon used to win wars, what was called the War Department, they summoned this West Point graduate, Lieutenant Rowan, who was summoned to the War Department in the Pentagon, walks in the room with all the generals. This young lieutenant walks in and said, "This message must get to Garcia." He simply walked up, grabbed the folder, stuck it in his satchel, saluted and said, "Yes, sir," walked out of the building and went on to go deliver the message down to Cuba. Now, the point of that message was he didn't ask in front of all the generals, "Who's Garcia? Where's Garcia? How do I find Garcia? Who's going to fund this trip?"
Yeah.
He understood the commander's intent. The guy was, a smart guy. He had actually, his background was suited. He was a cartographer. He spoke Spanish, had been to Cuba. He was a natural guy, and he knew what was happening. He knew what commander's intent was. He knew that this message, he knew who Garcia was. And again, resourceful young West Point graduates, all service academy graduates, when you're handed a mission by your superiors, they don't tell you what to do or how to do it. They just give you the order. This is what needs to be done, and you go execute. And that's the whole basis of why Message Garcia resonates, because I realized at that moment in time, I thought my Message Garcia moment would happen when I'm a SEAL team platoon commander back in the late 90s, when I was leading, SEAL Team 3 platoon, and we were called up to set up a CSAR det for Saddam was splashing the YouTube flights that were going over enforcing the sanctions. And I stood on standby for 3 weeks, ready to go in to do a combat search and rescue mission. But it didn't happen. And like most of us who are called to serve, that moment that we're called for, it doesn't come when we expect it. And it comes when we least expect it. And for me, it happened I was 35. I'm a reservist. I was about to go home to my wife and start a family. But God called, and the nation called, and I stepped up, and it's what became the next 2 years of my life. As I called it, my mission, Daniel in the lion's den. I got firsthand experience of the same biblical Daniel who was in Babylon, and I happened to be in Baghdad. But so that's going to be the themes. But again, bring it to today, why is it important, is over my 2 years, we had 448 kidnappings. And the insurgency and jihadists, they weren't taking original playbook. They have used this mindset and ideology going back to the 72 Olympics, when they grabbed, the Black September grabbed the Israeli hostages, and that iconic image of the guy with the balaclava looking over the side of the building. Well, then we had the 1979 overthrow of the American embassy. It woke up the world in America. Most people didn't even know what Iran or Iraq was, much less what Islamic, ideology was, theocracy. And it comes back time and time again. You had the Lebanon crisis, the kidnapping crisis in the 80s under Reagan. You had Iran-Contra, the failed embassy attempt, the rescue attempt. And when Iraq stood up, for decades we learned, don't launch hostage rescue. They're fraught with disaster, and the consequences of political fallout can be catastrophic if you try and negotiate with hostages. So for about 2 decades, we didn't do that. But after Iraq and my tour, we were forced to deal with this. And eventually we turned the tide of 30, 40 kidnappings a month. They were in single digits by the time I left. And the task force finally got off their keisters and took out this kidnapping ring that I had identified about 6 months into my tour. And for about a year, I kept pleading with, the leadership, here's the kidnapping ring. They're based in Baghdad. It's run by a professor of Islamic study at Baghdad University who would invite journalists to his mosque, and then he would kidnap them as soon as they left. And this guy, millions, and funded the insurgency. And again, why it's relevant is that we saw every 4 or 5 years after I left, we saw the kidnapping tool. The Taliban used it very effectively with Bo Bergdahl. I mean, hell, they swapped a E4, E5 who walked off his post, abandoned his post for 5 major ranking Taliban leaders and Al-Qaeda leaders.
Your government doesn't care about you. That's why you need a medical emergency kit. It contains life-saving medications like ivermectin, Z-Pak, and antibiotics. Stock them before they block them.
We recommend you take this moment to do what we're about to do, which is enjoy an Alp.
Al-Qaeda leader, the equivalent of training a buck private for 5 generals, which is what happened. Then you had ISIS, the rise of ISIS. They started putting these beheading videos back out on the net. And then what happened, October 7th of last year, Hamas staged the largest mass kidnapping almost in history, which continues to this day. Yeah. And I would make the argument that there will be another 9/11. And I guarantee you one of those scenarios will be a mass kidnapping. Imagine 3 suicide bombers walking into an elementary school in Arizona at 1:00 Eastern Standard Time. And then
it's going to happen. Yeah.
In Kansas at a high school, the same scenario. It happens simultaneously in, say, Ohio and a liberal arts college in the Northeast. 4 schools, 3 different time zones, 4 or 5 schools, 3 different time zones simultaneously. Can you imagine what it would do for this country to have a hostage scenario scene play out like a Beslan, but Beslan times 4 or 5? And that was
the Russian,
correct.
The Chechens who came in and
killed
a lot of children. Yeah.
And Lynn, we know that, Sarah McAdams has talked about this repeatedly, that in that 4 years with no border, 10 to 20 million people walked across our border. We don't know exactly the numbers. Low estimates are that 1,000 insurgents and jihadis with ISIS and Al-Qaeda connections have infiltrated. And why wouldn't they have walked across the border, right? And that they're plotting the next incident that could be a massacre. Europe has had multiple incidents where 4 or 5 armed gunmen have taken over, venue halls, concert halls, and the whole combination of, hostage taking, suicide vests, suicide bombs, IEDs. If we don't think that can happen again, and just because it hasn't happened on our soil, America will not be ready for it. The only people who are going to understand it and go, well, welcome to the world I lived in over that deployment, or multiple, between Iraq and Afghanistan, because suicide bombings and IEDs and VBIEDs, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, were happening on a daily basis for every soldier, airman, sailor, and Marine that deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan from, 2001 up until 2018, 2020.
So the book is called Into the Lion's Den. You can pre-order it at historyofbooks.com or anywhere, actually, but just to put that out there. So I wanted, I thought of you this morning because Trump said this morning that he wants to take back Bagram Air Base, and you were very much involved with Operation Pineapple, moving, American assets out of Afghanistan that were Afghanis that, helped the Americans, and you were very involved in that. But what do you think of that whole concept of taking back Bagram?
Well, we never should have given up Bagram in the first place. Had we not given up Bagram, which was what General Scotty Miller had recommended to the president, and keeping behind a stay-behind force, a stabilizing force of roughly 2,500 troops and combat enablers, we could have held on to Afghanistan and held on to probably the most strategic air base in the region to not only deal with what's on the horizon right now for America. What are our 2 biggest threats right now? Take out Ukraine, but our biggest threats right now are China and Iran. And Bagram was within an hour's flight of both, less than an hour's flight, frankly, between Iran and China for a strategic enemy. So yes, there was that speculation that a plane, in April went in, a C-17 landed in Kabul, or Bagram, sorry, with reportedly one of the deputy directors of the CIA to start the negotiation. And I've heard through the network that China, Afghanistan, Kabul, the Taliban are not happy with China. And anyone who works with China listen, China has the Belt and Road Initiative. I saw this in Asia. I know they're all over South America, and I saw it in Africa on some of my trips. China is everywhere. And when they go into a place and they make a deal, you're making a deal with the devil. They put in infrastructure, roads, ports, but then they make you pay back that loan. And those are not good terms. And people are finding out that the U.S. The only people who hate doing business and hate America are the people within our border, ironically enough, and members of the Democratic Party. I can't, it boggles the mind, because we are good partners overseas. We are good steeds and good relationships, despite all, the challenges we do have. And so if we do, Trump says a lot of things, right? Greenland, we want to annex Canada as a 51st state. And he does it to get people wrapped around the axle for a lot of things. But I think the Bagram discussion, even the fact that it's even being discussed, is certainly rattling Beijing and certainly making Tehran. I mean, look what Trump just pulled off last week during Mother's Day. I mean, the only thing he didn't do was deliver flowers, provide 1-800-Flowers for every mother in America. He was more focused on, what's happening in the Middle East, potentially trillions of more investment coming back into the U.S.
Yes.
I know he's apparently backdoor negotiation to resolve a Pakistani-India conflict that's brewing right now. And the Zelensky meeting that may or may not be happening. I mean, the negotiations to resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's happening, despite, all the naysayers. But
it's happening.
It's been 100 days of very consequential things, from the tariffs to everything else. So,
and they got to get Edan Alexander out of Gaza. How many do you think there are any hostages left alive? That's your business.
So he reportedly is the last American that we've got home. Now, I'm on Signal. I'm getting feedback from Israel on a daily update that I keep informed on. And again, there were 251 taken total, and they range from as young as like 9 months old to like 85, 86 years old. They're now down to what was somewhere between 40 and 50 still behind, which are principally military age males and reservists and or Israeli army folks that they're going to be held to the bitter end. What I've heard is the estimate is that maybe 30 are still alive. Again, don't know that, but of the 251, they now have recovered because of what Trump pulled off last weekend. There's no more American hostages being held that we know of. But there's probably another 30 that are being held in horrific conditions in these tunnels that still exist. And it's heartbreaking for those families, because they're past 500 days held. And what I've seen interviews with the hostages, they're basically being fed one piece of stale pita bread a day, which it's the American. I saw the image of him hugging his family. He definitely looked gaunt, and you've seen other hostages being released that have certainly lost considerable weight, but he didn't look as bad as it could have been, at least the American, from what I saw. So, but that
probably because he was American, I would think.
Probably, but I mean, Todd, you're a SEER graduate. Can you imagine living in SEER-like conditions, food-wise alone, and being in a tunnel? There's sensory. I mean, these hostages are going to have a lifetime of counseling and treatment because of that. Of course. Every time they close their eyes and go to sleep, they're going to be having these flashbacks. It's going to be a long road.
You're talking about serious survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training, but
POW training for U.S. pilots and anyone who can special operations forces that stand the risk of being captured and held by an enemy. Yes.
Anything else we should be aware of in the region, Dan? You've got the expertise.
Well, I think we still have to be. Iraq is still, and Syria. I think Syria is something that, I mean, I'm seeing numbers, tens of thousands of Christians that are being slaughtered in Syria right now.
That's a big problem. Yeah.
And President Trump just met, I believe, shook hands with the current leader, who's a former ISIS member, who is now a wolf dressed in a suit. But, my experience, 30 odd years in the region, you trust no one. And, it is there is genocide going on. And the genocide that's happening is in the Christian communities in that region that no one is talking about. And it's heartbreaking. And that's something that needs to be,
we're trying to raise that issue. I think that the meeting with Galani, who you're talking about, I forget his new name, Al Shabara or whatever. I think I think that's a bigger play. I think Erdogan wanted that, so Trump gave it to Erdogan because Erdogan is pushing Zelensky to negotiate and solve the Russian problem in Istanbul as we speak. So I think that was a bigger play. And Trump is weighing the odds and getting the big conflict solved. But yeah, that's a big problem. Christian massacres in Syria and Iraq and all over. They've been depopulated essentially. But anyway, thank you for coming on, Dan. Really appreciate it. Short notice, my friend. And
always. We'll talk again soon. And I got to get back to some research and get that draft back to Curtin and Hysteria. But we're going to get it done, and I'm sure I'll be back on board with seeing you guys in the future.
Talk soon. Ciao.
Cheers.
Take care.